Welcome to a very special deep dive. Today we have a mission that's really twofold.
Right, because we are looking at an incredibly tense, historic, breaking news event that's literally unfolding in the Middle East right now.
Exactly. But we're going to approach this through a very specific lens, a lens that I think is super helpful. We're looking at this crisis kind of from an English teacher's perspective.
Yeah, treating it almost like a masterclass in the English language.
Right. Our goal here is to help you, the listener, decode the news. We want to help you unpack the critical vocabulary and really understand how the language of power and the language of reporting actively construct the reality we end up perceiving.
It's just such a crucial way to process this kind of information, because when history is unfolding in real time like this, the specific words chosen by politicians or generals or journalists, they don't just describe the events.
No, they dictate them.
Exactly. They shape the entire narrative.
And the subject we're applying this to today is massive. I mean, our sources detail this unprecedented wave of U.S. and Israeli airstrikes on Iran.
We're looking at Donald Trump's claim that Iran's Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has been killed in those strikes.
And we are tracking Iran's very fiery, immediate retaliation across the Gulf. But before we go a single step further, we really need to pause here.
Yes, we need to issue a very clear, explicit disclaimer.
Right. This deep dive obviously centers on highly politically charged content. We're talking about the United States, Israel, Iran. And we must make it absolutely clear to you that we are not taking any sides here whatsoever.
None. We are not endorsing the viewpoints, we're not endorsing the military actions or the political rhetoric of any figures, leaders, or nations that we mentioned today.
Our sole purpose is just to impartially report on the content provided in these sources. We're here to analytically break down the English language and the journalistic frameworks used to convey these ideas.
Right, we are here strictly as guides to the language of the news. Because when geopolitical chaos erupts, the sheer volume of information can be totally overwhelming.
It's a flood. And language is the map we use to navigate that chaos. So let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
When news breaks at this kind of scale, the reporting is just disjointed updates, push notifications. And for anyone reading these dispatches in English, the hidden architecture holding the whole narrative together is the connector.
The structural phrases.
Yes. Journalists use very specific structural phrases to build a timeline out of pure chaos. So let's look at how the sources construct the timeline of this particular day.
Okay, so the inciting incident in these reports is universally anchored by a phrase like, well, the sources use following the launch of.
Following the launch of.
Right. The sources state that following the launch of a wave of U.S. and Israeli airstrikes on multiple targets across Iran, the entire region was plunged into a new paradigm.
And what makes the timeline constructed by the media so surreal here is the stark juxtaposition of the events leading up to that connector.
Oh, the whiplash is intense.
It's crazy. The sources note that just hours prior to this massive military action, Donald Trump was casually campaigning in a Texas hamburger joint.
Right, buying burgers for the crowd.
Yeah, he's buying burgers, reportedly mentioning he was going to get some stuff for Air Force One, and then following the launch of the strikes, the narrative just violently shifts.
Suddenly, Trump is on his Truth Social platform, announcing to the world that Iran's supreme leader is dead, framing the operation as a tremendous success.
Which the BBC sources note, if true, marks a seismic moment for the region.
And that brings us to the next crucial structural pivot that reporters use, which is in response.
In response. So when you're reading an article and you hit in response, what does that signal to you as a reader?
It signals a shift from the offensive action to the counter-narrative, or the defensive maneuver. The sources report that in response to these claims from the U.S., Iran immediately rejected the reports.
Right. Iranian state media stepped in to state firmly that Khamenei was safe and sound. They dismissed the American death claims as mere psychological warfare.
And notice how in response frames the Iranian position psychologically for you, the reader, before you even finish the sentence.
It establishes a reactionary dynamic right away.
Exactly. But obviously the situation didn't just remain rhetorical, which forces reporters to use causative language. Specifically, the connector led to.
Led to. The bridge from political statements back to physical reality.
Right. The sources outline how the initial airstrikes and the claims led to immediate retaliation. Iran didn't just issue denials. The reporting details how they fired accurate short-range missiles and low-flying explosive drones.
And they aimed them specifically at Gulf Arab states that host U.S. military bases. So the connector led to establishes this direct, undeniable chain of cause and effect.
And then, When the scope of a crisis widens beyond the initial actors, the journalistic language has to expand as well. We see this with the phrase, further escalating the situation.
Further escalating. The sources use this to describe the broader global fallout. Because further escalating the situation, Iran announced it's closing the Strait of Hormuz,
Which is a critical global choke point.
Right. Closing it immediately threatens worldwide oil and gas exports. And simultaneously, the UN Security Council called an emergency meeting in New York to address what the Secretary General called uncontrollable consequences.
So by analyzing just how those 4 structural phrases are deployed, following the launch of, in response, led to, and further escalating the situation, you can actually take a sprawling global crisis and structure it logically in your head.
The language literally builds the timeline for you.
It does.
Okay, let's shift our focus from how the timeline is built to the actual verbs and nouns populating these articles. I really want to look closely at the action words of this conflict.
The vocabulary of military news is incredibly precise.
It really is. And the connotations of these words drastically alter how a reader perceives the severity of an event. So what stands out to you in the initial strike reports?
For me, it's the media's choice to use the words targeted and compound. It's fascinating. The sources don't say the U.S. and Israel bombed a neighborhood or hit a residence.
Right.
They say the operations targeted a compound in Tehran.
And that specific pairing completely shifts your perception of the action. If you're learning English, you need to know that the verb targeted implies surgical precision. It implies intelligence gathering.
It subtly tells the reader this wasn't reckless or random.
Exactly. And by choosing compound over house or home, the language instantly militarizes the location in your mind. A compound implies walls, high security, a legitimate military objective.
It makes a strike feel much more justified. And we see a similar linguistic framing with Iran's reaction. The sources consistently say Iran chose to retaliate.
Retaliate. That carries a very different psychological weight than simply attack.
Intrinsically.
Right.
Retaliate implies a justification. It tells the reader that this violence is a return of fire. It's a direct consequence of a previous transgression rather than just unprovoked aggression.
Right. But the human impact of that retaliation introduces another really heavily loaded term, which is debris.
This is a big one.
Our sources share a very vivid, pretty unsettling anecdote about the Fairmont Hotel on Dubai's Palm. You have tourists looking for winter sun who suddenly get a terrifying reminder of the region's realities when that luxury hotel is hit.
Sending black plumes of smoke into the sky.
Yeah. But the reporters note it isn't completely clear if the hotel was targeted directly or if it was hit by missile debris from an interceptor rocket.
And the word debris does a massive amount of work there to sterilize the destruction.
How so?
Well, when the media specifies that the damage might have come from debris rather than a direct missile strike, it changes the narrative of intent. It suggests an accidental byproduct of a defensive measure.
Ah, the interceptor rocket.
Right. Rather than a deliberate attempt to kill civilians, it softens the psychological blow of a luxury hotel being engulfed in flames.
Wow. And that leads directly into how the sources handle the concept of human life in general. Specifically with the word casualties, Trump used some incredibly intense language leading up to this, warning that American casualties and fatalities might occur. Now, casualties is a clinical, almost bureaucratic term that encompasses anyone killed or injured.
It totally lacks the visceral punch of saying dead soldiers or wounded civilians.
Exactly. And he justified this clinical risk by stating his plan to totally obliterate Iran's missile industry.
The juxtaposition of those two words is just striking. Casualties minimizes the human cost, while obliterate maximizes the intended impact on the enemy.
Because to obliterate doesn't just mean to damage a facility.
No, it has apocalyptic undertones. It means to wipe something completely off the map.
And we see the reality of that destruction spilling over when the sources discuss the Gulf allies caught in the crossfire. We're talking about the UAE, Qatar, which hosts the Doha Air Base, and Bahrain, which is home to the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet headquarters.
Because they host these American bases, they are now facing the physical destruction of this conflict, or the ruins.
Yeah, and diplomatic ruins, too. There is a chilling quote from the reporters on the ground noting that the Gulf states, quote, "will not forgive Tehran for this."
Will not forgive. That phrase is heavy with geopolitical consequence. It isn't just a statement of current anger.
What is it then?
It's a linguistic prediction of future regional alignment. It suggests a permanent fracturing of diplomatic relations in the Middle East, driven by the physical ruins left by those low-flying drones.
Now, here is where it gets really interesting for anyone trying to parse the news. We've looked at the timeline connectors, we've looked at the connotations of military vocabulary, but to truly master reading English news, you have to understand tone.
Yes, the tone is everything.
This event provides the ultimate masterclass in media literacy, specifically in the stark contrast between political hyperbole and objective journalism.
Let's start by analyzing the political rhetoric. Donald Trump's language throughout these sources is a textbook example of hyperbolic persuasion.
He relies on extreme adjectives and heavy emotional appeals.
Right. He doesn't just call the airstrikes an attack. He refers to the action as epic fury and a massive attack.
Epic fury sounds cinematic. It sounds like dialogue from a blockbuster movie, not a standard geopolitical briefing.
And it does more than just sound dramatic. That kind of phrasing elevates a military operation into a historical crusade.
Right.
He describes the Iranian regime not simply as an adversary, but as a vicious group of very hard, terrible people. And he calls the Supreme Leader one of the most evil people in history.
He frames the military action as a noble mission.
Exactly. And in a persuasive context, this rhetoric is highly calculated. It is designed to shape the narrative, justify extreme unilateral actions, and incite a visceral emotional response from the audience.
The sources note he even promises a prosperous and glorious future to encourage Iranians to overthrow or topple their regime.
Notice the choice of overthrow instead of change or replace. It implies a violent, physical uprooting of power.
That is the language of persuasion. It is explicitly meant to make you feel something and to mobilize action. Now, let's pivot to how the journalists at the BBC handle this exact same event. The linguistic universe completely flips.
It's night and day. The BBC relies on strict neutrality. Instead of declarative, emotional statements, they anchor their reporting in visual, evidence-based descriptions.
You don't hear them say, "The U.S. decisively destroyed the enemy compound"?
No, you hear them say, "Satellite images showed the destruction," or "Plumes of smoke were seen."
Were seen. That use of the passive voice is such a critical tool for journalists. It completely removes the reporter's personal judgment and the actor's intent from the sentence.
It simply presents the physical evidence as an undeniable fact, leaving the interpretation up to the reader.
Furthermore, the handling of uncertainty is the absolute hallmark of objective journalism. Even with the U.S. president definitively declaring the Supreme Leader dead on social media, the BBC flatly refuses to state it as a fact.
Right. They use conditional phrases to protect the integrity of their reporting. They write, "If confirmed, it is a seismic moment."
If confirmed, those two words act as the journalist's shield.
Yes. It acknowledges the claim without legally or historically validating it. They freely admit their logistical limitations to the audience too, stating plainly, it's hard to get information about what's happening there.
And to ensure balanced reporting, they immediately offer the opposing side's perspective within the same paragraph. When Trump claims a victory, the BBC follows up with claims Tehran has dismissed as psychological warfare.
Spotting the difference between persuasive context, where a figure uses extreme adjectives like epic fury to sell you a viewpoint, and objective context, where a reporter uses conditional phrases like if confirmed, and visual evidence is your absolute best defense against information overload.
It fundamentally changes how you process the news. You stop reacting to the emotion and start analyzing the mechanics of the message.
And if we connect this linguistic analysis to the bigger picture, it helps us see the global posturing taking place among other players on the geopolitical chessboard.
Like the UK.
Exactly. Consider how UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer had to navigate this incredibly carefully. He emphasized to the press that British planes were in the sky strictly for defensive operations.
The sources make a point to highlight that the UK, alongside France and Germany, did not endorse or participate in the offensive U.S. and Israeli strikes.
And defensive operations is a massive linguistic distinction.
They are signaling that they are acting within international law to protect allies from incoming threats, while maintaining a very distinct, deliberate distance from the aggressive offensive maneuvers.
It is a diplomatic tightrope walked entirely through vocabulary.
So what does this all mean for the people actually on the ground? Because beneath the political hyperbole, the conditional reporting, the carefully worded diplomatic statements, there are human lives experiencing this reality.
The sources describe a profound mixture of emotions inside Iran.
The reality on the streets, according to the reporting, is incredibly complex. The articles detail absolute panic in the streets of Tehran at 9:40 in the morning. Buildings were literally shaking, and people were terrified as a war seemingly started right outside their office windows.
Yet, simultaneously, there was a completely contradictory reaction. The sources mention video circulating of teenagers at a school actively celebrating the airstrikes.
Which seems shocking at first glance.
It does. But to understand why citizens might celebrate an attack on their own soil, you have to look at the historical context the reporters provide.
The sources remind the reader that just back in January, the Iranian regime executed brutal crackdowns on domestic protests,
crushing them with live bullets that reportedly killed thousands of people. For segments of the population who suffered intimately under that brutality, the desperation is so high that some feel only external military intervention could possibly topple the regime.
But the tragedy of war, as the reporting makes painfully clear, is that it rarely hits only its intended militarized targets. The sources bring in a sobering reality that severely complicates any celebration of regime change.
State media in Iran reported that an Israeli strike hit a girls' school in Minab, killing dozens.
There is a devastating quote pulled from the local coverage that asks, "The first victims of this war are girls in Minab. Is this the war you cheer for?"
That quote slices right through the clinical language of targeted compounds and defensive operations. It highlights the horrific, unpredictable cost of conflict.
And the sources point out that this is exactly why successive U.S. presidents have historically shied away from this level of direct confrontation with Iran. They have feared a long, protracted, drawn-out disaster.
The reporters explicitly draw a historical parallel to the removal of Iraq's Saddam Hussein in 2003.
Right. That operation was also initially framed with the rhetoric of tremendous success and noble missions, but it ultimately led to a catastrophe and long years of war that incubated extremist movements across the region. Taking out a leader might play well in a persuasive political speech, but the reality on the ground is rarely surgical. It is messy, unpredictable, and overwhelmingly devastating for everyday civilians.
It is a heavy, incredibly complex situation to parse, both geopolitically and linguistically. So let's recap the analytical journey we've taken today.
We set out to decode a massive, ongoing geopolitical event by treating it as a text to be studied.
We've seen how to navigate a rapidly changing, chaotic timeline by looking for crucial English connectors like following the launch of, in response, and led to.
We've unpacked the loaded connotations behind the vocabulary of military conflict, how words like compound militarize a target, how debris sterilizes destruction, and how obliterate sets an apocalyptic tone.
Most importantly, we critically analyzed the stark linguistic divide between a politician's persuasive hyperbole, designed to evoke epic fury and mobilize action, and a journalist's objective reality, grounded in the passive voice, satellite images, and conditional shields like if confirmed. I really want to emphasize that this linguistic toolkit we've discussed today doesn't just apply to reading about the Middle East.
Not at all. Whether you are reading an article about a contentious local election, a corporate merger, or a natural disaster, you can use these exact same analytical skills to decode the news.
You can identify the persuasive rhetoric, strip it away, and separate the actual facts from the manufactured fury.
And this raises an important question to leave you with, something to consider as you continue to watch this specific story develop.
As the smoke eventually clears and the physical debris is swept away from the streets of Tehran and Dubai, what happens when the psychological warfare and the hyperbolic language outlast the actual missiles?
If a modern war is fought just as fiercely with curated vocabulary, narrative framing, and social media posts as it is with airstrikes, how do everyday people ever find their way back to a shared truth?
That is a profound thought and a challenge to all of us who consume the news.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep reading closely, keep listening critically, and most importantly, keep questioning not just what you read, but exactly how it is written. We will see you next time.
喜欢这种学习方式，欢迎订阅我的频道，让我们一起用下一个10分钟，把商业英文变简单。